The underground chamber beneath the Alexandrov Kremlin smells of iron and incense, and something else, something organic and wrong, that catches in the back of the throat and refuses to leave. The year is 1571, and the woman chained to the stone wall is named Marfa Vasilievna Sobakina. She is 19 years old. She has been the Tsarina of all Russia for exactly 12 days. She can feel the cold of the chains cutting into her wrists where they have rubbed the skin raw over 3 days of hanging. She can hear the chanting of the black-robed monks who stand in the corners of the chamber, their faces hidden in shadow, reciting prayers that sound less like worship and more like incantation. She can see the instruments arranged on the wooden table before her iron pincers still warm from the brazier, copper implements whose purposes she cannot identify, but whose implications make her bowels loosen with terror, glass vials containing liquids that catch the torchlight with oily gleams. She was, until 15 days ago, the winner of the greatest bride show in Russian history, chosen from over 2,000 young women brought to Moscow from every corner of the Tsardom, selected by Ivan Vasilievich himself as the most beautiful, the most suitable, the most worthy to become his third wife and give him the heirs his dynasty required. Her father had wept with joy when the Tsar's messengers arrived. Her mother had sewn her wedding garments with trembling hands. The entire Sobakina family had risen from minor nobility to the inner circle of power in a single afternoon. Now she hangs in a chamber that officially does not exist, watched by men in black robes who are not quite monks and not quite soldiers, the Oprichniki, Ivan's personal enforcers, who have sworn oaths to the Tsar that supersede all obligations to God, family, or humanity. The broom and dog's head that hang from their saddles symbolize their mission, to sweep away treason and bite the Tsar's enemies. But the enemies they bite most often are women. She does not know yet that she will be dead within 3 days. She does not know that the poison already coursing through her veins, administered in tiny doses over the past 2 weeks, will finish its work before the week ends. She does not know that Ivan will declare her death the result of witchcraft, will execute dozens of people he claims conspired to murder his bride, will use her death as justification for a new wave of terror that will kill tens of thousands. What she knows is that her husband, the man she married 12 days ago, the man who is supposed to protect her, the man who holds absolute power over every person in Russia, is standing in the shadows of this chamber, watching what his men are doing to her, and that the expression on his face is not horror or concern or even indifference. It is fascination. "Tell me again," Ivan says, his voice soft and almost gentle, "about the conspiracy against me." "There is no conspiracy, my lord." Her voice is barely a whisper. She has said these words 100 times over the past 3 days. "I swear before God and all his saints, there is no conspiracy." "Then why are you sick, my little bird? Why do you grow weaker each day while my physicians can find no cause? Someone is killing you. Someone in my own court, in my own household, is murdering my bride. And you will tell me who." She cannot tell him because she does not know. She does not know that the poison comes from Ivan himself, administered by his own servants on his own orders, testing whether she might be an assassin sent by his enemies, testing whether the Sobakina family might be plotting against him, testing simply because Ivan tests everyone and trusts no one and finds something satisfying in watching beautiful things break. The Oprichnina with the heated pincers steps forward. Ivan nods, almost imperceptibly. And what happens next in that chamber beneath the Alexandrov Kremlin is why Hollywood will never, can never, tell the true story of what Ivan the Terrible did to the women in his life. What you are about to learn has been systematically suppressed for 450 years by historians who found the truth too disturbing to include in respectable accounts. You know about Ivan the Terrible. You have heard about his conquest of Kazan, his expansion of Russian territory, his creation of the first centralized Russian state. You may know that he killed his own son in a fit of rage. The famous painting by Repin shows Ivan cradling his dying heir, eyes wild with horror at what he has done. But you do not know about the women. You do not know that Ivan married at least 7 times, possibly 8, and that every single one of these marriages ended in the woman's death, disappearance, or forced exile to a convent, where she would spend the rest of her life in isolated captivity. You do not know that the pattern of these endings was so consistent that modern forensic historians have concluded Ivan was systematically destroying the women he married using methods that ranged from slow poisoning to sudden violence to psychological torture, so severe that the victims simply stopped functioning as human beings. You do not know about the Oprichnina, the state within a state that Ivan created in 1565, staffed by men who wore black robes and rode black horses, and swore oaths of absolute obedience that made them into something between secret police and religious cult. You do not know what these men did to the wives and daughters of nobles, suspected of disloyalty, or simply nobles whose property Ivan wanted to seize, whose bloodlines he wanted to end, whose existence he found inconvenient. Tonight you will learn what Ivan's system did to women. You will learn about the bride shows that gathered thousands of young women for inspection, like livestock at a market. You will learn about the preparation that selected brides underwent before their wedding nights, procedures documented in court records that have never been translated into English. You will learn about the fates of 7 Tsarinas and countless noblewomen who entered Ivan's orbit and emerged, if they emerged at all, as shadows of the people they had been. You will learn about Marfa Sobakina, who was 19 years old and Tsarina for 15 days before dying of a poison that modern toxicologists have identified from the analysis of her remains. You will learn about Maria Dolgorukaya, who was drowned the morning after her wedding night because Ivan discovered she was not a virgin. You will learn about Anna Vasilchikova, who was forced into a convent at age 23 and spent the next 40 years in a cell so small she could not fully extend her arms. Subscribe if you want to understand the hidden history of one of the most brutal regimes in human memory. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. Because Marfa is still hanging in that chamber beneath the Alexandrov Kremlin, and the Oprichnik with the heated pincers is approaching her, and I am going to tell you exactly what happened in that room, and in dozens of other rooms, to dozens of other women, across the 24 years of Ivan's reign of terror. But first, I need to warn you. This is not the romantic tragedy of a tormented ruler. This is not the psychological drama of a brilliant but unstable mind. This is what actually happened to real women. Women with names and families and lives that were systematically destroyed by a man who held absolute power and used it to break every woman who came within his reach. I am going to be specific, because these women deserve to have their experiences acknowledged accurately. And I am going to make you understand that the monster in this story is not mental illness or historical circumstance. The monster is a system designed to identify women, isolate them, break them, and dispose of them with the same methodical efficiency that characterized everything Ivan did. Let us begin with the bride shows. The Russian bride show was an institution that combined beauty pageant, livestock auction, and political calculation into a process that determined which women would be destroyed by proximity to power. When a czar required a wife, messengers were sent to every province of the realm, commanding noble families to present their eligible daughters for inspection. The process was theoretically voluntary. No family was legally required to participate. In practice, refusal was impossible. A family that refused to present their daughters was declaring either that they had something to hide or that they considered themselves above the czar's requirements. Either interpretation could be fatal. The numbers were staggering. For Ivan's second bride show in 1561, approximately 1,500 young women were gathered in Moscow for the initial inspection. For his third show in 1571, the number exceeded 2,000. These women came from every corner of Russia, from wealthy boyar families in Moscow to minor nobles in distant provinces, from established dynasties to families barely above the level of prosperous merchants. They were gathered first in regional centers, where local officials conducted preliminary inspections. The criteria were specific and documented in administrative records that survive in Russian archives. Age between 15 and 23. Height within specified ranges. Weight proportionate to height. Skin clear of blemishes, scars, or birthmarks in visible locations. Hair thick and lustrous. Teeth present and uncorrupted. Bearing dignified but not proud. Voice pleasing but not shrill. Movements graceful but not theatrical. Beyond these physical requirements, investigators examined family histories for any hint of scandal, disloyalty, or connection to the Tsar's enemies. They interrogated servants about the young women's temperaments, their habits, their private behaviors. They questioned priests about confession patterns, looking for evidence of sins that might indicate problematic character. Approximately 70% of candidates were eliminated at the regional level. The remaining 30%, perhaps 500 to 600 women, were transported to Moscow for the next stage of evaluation. Modern historians who have analyzed these records recognize the process as deliberately dehumanizing. By reducing women to lists of physical measurements and behavioral assessments, the system trained everyone involved, candidates, families, officials, to view these women not as persons but as products. The woman who would eventually become Tsarina was not chosen for her character, her intelligence, her compatibility with the Tsar. She was chosen because her measurements matched specifications and her background contained no disqualifying factors. This dehumanization was not accidental. It was preparation for what came after. The Moscow examinations took place over approximately 3 weeks. The young women were housed in a specially prepared section of the Kremlin, separated from their families, attended by servants who reported every word and action to the selection committee. The examinations themselves were conducted by teams that included physicians, priests, and female attendants who served as the Tsar's eyes in spaces where male observers could not go. These examinations were thorough in ways that surviving documents describe with clinical precision. Physical examinations assessed not merely visible attributes but internal health. Physicians examined women for signs of disease, defect, or conditions that might affect childbearing. The methods used documented in medical texts from the period included procedures that modern gynecologists recognize as invasive and potentially traumatic. Psychological evaluations tested reactions to stress, unexpected situations, and deliberate provocations. Attendants might stage conflicts to observe how candidates responded. Officials might deliver false news that a family member was sick, that a scandal had emerged at home to assess emotional stability. Women who showed too much reaction were marked as unstable. Women who showed too little were marked as cold or calculating. The ideal response was genuine but restrained distress, followed by composed acceptance of whatever the Tsar's servants told her. Behavioral observations continued throughout the 3 weeks. How did the candidate eat? How did she sleep? Did she pray sincerely or merely perform piety? Did she get along with the other candidates or create conflicts? Did she attempt to bribe servants, cultivate allies, or manipulate the process in any way? The surviving records from Ivan's bride shows contain detailed notes on individual candidates, notes that read like quality control assessments in a manufacturing process. Candidate 17. Physical specifications acceptable. Teeth show minor discoloration, treatable with available remedies. Behavioral profile indicates strong will, potentially difficult to manage. Family connections include second cousin to the Shwisky clan, politically significant but potentially problematic. Recommendation: advance to final round with notation of concerns. Candidate 43. Exceptional physical specifications, exceeding requirements in all categories. Behavioral profile indicates pliability and eagerness to please. Family connections: minimal provincial minor nobility with no significant political ties. Recommendation: advance to final round as primary candidate. The women were not told the results of these assessments. They were not told where they stood in the competition. They were kept in deliberate uncertainty, never knowing if they would be selected, sent home, or simply made to disappear. This uncertainty was itself a test. Women who crumbled under the pressure of not knowing were eliminated. Women who maintained composure despite the psychological strain demonstrated the kind of stability the Tsar required. Approximately 100 women advanced to the final round, where Ivan himself would make the selection. The final selection was the first time most candidates saw the Tsar directly. Ivan Vasilievich was, by all accounts, physically imposing, tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing blue eyes that witnesses described as capable of conveying both intense interest and terrifying malevolence, sometimes in the same moment. He was also, by 1571, showing the effects of decades of debauchery and violence. His hair had thinned, his body had thickened. His hands trembled slightly from the combination of mercury treatments and alcohol consumption that characterized his daily existence. But his presence still dominated any room he entered. The Tsar was God's representative on earth. To be in his presence was to be in the presence of divine authority made flesh. The candidates who stood before him were acutely aware that this man held absolute power over their lives, not merely in the metaphorical sense, but literally. He could order any of them killed with a gesture. He could order any of them married, confined, exiled, rewarded, or destroyed. Their futures existed entirely at his discretion. The selection process at this stage was personal and arbitrary, in ways the earlier stages had not been. Ivan walked among the candidates, examining them closely, asking questions that seemed designed more to provoke reactions than to gather information. "You are pretty enough," he might say to one candidate, "but I have been told your grandmother was a Tatar. How much of that pagan blood runs in your veins? Your father was loyal to me during the Kazan campaign," he might say to another, "but I am told he has been speaking with the Lithuanians. Would you spy for him, do you think, if I put you in a position to do so? You have a pleasant face," he might tell a third, "but my last wife had a pleasant face, and she died screaming in childbirth. Are you prepared to scream for me?" These questions had no right answers. The candidates could only respond, and hope their responses did not trigger whatever dark currents moved through the Tsar's mind. Some were dismissed immediately, sent away without explanation. Some were kept standing for hours while Ivan interrogated others. Some were called forward for closer examination, told to walk, to turn, to speak specific phrases while the Tsar studied them with the intensity of a man evaluating horseflesh. The final selection happened in a private chamber, where Ivan met individually with the dozen or so candidates who had survived every previous stage. What happened in these private meetings is not documented in official records, but the accounts that survive in letters, memoirs, and foreign diplomatic reports suggest that Ivan used these meetings to assess candidates in ways that went far beyond conversation. By the time the selection was announced, the woman who would become Tsarina had already learned the first lesson of her new position. She existed entirely at Ivan's pleasure, and Ivan's pleasure was unpredictable, demanding, and potentially deadly. Let me tell you now about Maria Temryukovna, who was 18 years old when she won the second bride show in 1561, and about the 8 years that followed. Maria was a Circassian princess, daughter of a Muslim chieftain who had converted to Orthodox Christianity as a condition of the alliance that brought his daughter to Moscow. She was described by contemporaries as extraordinarily beautiful, with dark hair, dark eyes, and skin that seemed to glow with vitality. She was also described as spirited, intelligent, and possessed of a fierce temper that matched Ivan's own. The Tsar was, by all accounts, genuinely captivated by her. The early years of their marriage were characterized by what passed for happiness in Ivan's court: lavish gifts, public demonstrations of affection, an apparent partnership that gave Maria real influence over court politics. She bore Ivan a son, Vasily, who lived only a few weeks. She was pregnant again when the relationship began to change. The change came gradually, according to servant accounts compiled after Maria's death. Ivan began questioning her loyalty, first subtly, then with increasing intensity. He accused her of corresponding with her father's enemies. He accused her of preferring Circassian customs to Russian ones. He accused her of looking at other men, of criticizing his decisions in private, of failing to show proper submission. The accusations were groundless, or at least no evidence was ever produced to support them. But the accusations themselves were not the point. The point was to establish uncertainty, to make Maria constantly aware that her position was precarious, to force her into a state of perpetual anxiety that would make her easier to control. Week by week, the evidence from servant accounts shows the progression. Week 1. Ivan publicly questioned Maria's choice of clothing at a court function, suggesting it was too provocative for a Tsarina. She apologized and changed. He did not acknowledge the change. Week 3. Ivan dismissed 2 of Maria's personal servants without explanation. When she asked why, he told her that asking questions demonstrated she did not trust his judgment. She did not ask again. Week 6. Ivan moved Maria from their shared apartments to a separate wing of the Kremlin, saying he needed solitude for prayer and reflection. The move was presented as temporary. It became permanent. Week 10. Ivan ordered Maria's correspondence intercepted and read by his secretaries. She was told this was for her own protection, to ensure that no one was trying to manipulate her. She understood it meant she could no longer communicate privately with anyone. Week 15. Ivan accused Maria of trying to poison him. The accusation was made publicly before the assembled court. Maria collapsed in shock and had to be carried from the room. Within hours, Ivan announced that he had been testing her loyalty and was satisfied with her reaction. The fainting proved she was genuinely surprised by the accusation, which proved she was innocent. But the accusation had been made in public. Everyone had heard it. Maria's reputation was now tinged with suspicion that could never be fully erased. By the end of the first year, Maria had learned what every woman in Ivan's orbit eventually learned. There was no safe position. Obedience might be interpreted as scheming. Independence might be interpreted as disloyalty. Affection might be interpreted as manipulation. Coldness might be interpreted as hatred. Every action, every word, every expression could be the trigger that transformed Ivan from husband into destroyer. The system that broke Maria Temryukovna was not created specifically for her. It was refined over years, tested on dozens of women before her, and would be applied to dozens more after her death. Modern psychologists who have analyzed the patterns in Ivan's behavior and the responses of his victims recognize a deliberate architecture of control that mirrors techniques documented in cults, abusive relationships, and totalitarian regimes across history and culture. The first element was isolation. Every woman who entered Ivan's close circle was systematically separated from her support network. Family members were kept at distance, sometimes physically removed from court, sometimes simply frozen out of meaningful contact. Servants were replaced with people who reported to Ivan rather than to the woman they ostensibly served. Friends were investigated, interrogated, and frequently arrested on manufactured charges. The second element was unpredictability. Ivan deliberately alternated between warmth and coldness, between lavish generosity and sudden cruelty. A woman might receive a spectacular gift one day, jewels, lands, titles, and be subjected to public humiliation the next. This unpredictability made it impossible to establish psychological equilibrium. The women were kept in constant vigilance, never knowing what might trigger the next explosion. The third element was reality distortion. Ivan's accusations were never simple lies that could be easily refuted. They were exaggerations, misinterpretations, twisted versions of events that contained just enough truth to be confusing. A woman who met with a foreign ambassador in a perfectly innocent context might find herself accused of treason, not quite accused of the specific meeting, but accused of secret communications with enemies in ways that made the innocent meeting suddenly suspicious. The boundary between reality and Ivan's paranoid interpretations became increasingly blurred. The fourth element was physical control. Beyond the psychological manipulation, Ivan maintained absolute authority over the physical circumstances of every woman's life. Where they slept, what they ate, who they saw, what they wore, when they could leave their chambers, all of this was subject to Ivan's whim. A woman who displeased him might find herself confined to increasingly small spaces, denied access to sunlight, prevented from bathing, subjected to physical discomforts that degraded her sense of self, without constituting actionable abuse. The fifth element was the threat of worse. Everyone in Ivan's court knew what the Oprichniki could do. Everyone had heard the stories or witnessed directly what happened in the chambers beneath the Alexandrov Kremlin. The threat did not need to be stated explicitly. It was omnipresent. Every woman who entered Ivan's circle understood that the alternative to compliance was not merely death, but something worse than death. Maria Temryukovna endured this system for 8 years. By the end, according to the fragmentary accounts that survive, she had been reduced to a state of perpetual anxiety that manifested in physical symptoms: trembling hands, inability to eat, sleep disturbances that kept her awake for days at a time. When she died in 1569 officially of illness, though foreign observers suspected poison witnesses described her as a shadow of the vital woman she had been. The Tsarina died with the face of an old woman, a foreign diplomat wrote. Though she was only 26 years of age, her eyes had the look of one who had seen too much and wished only to stop seeing. I believe she welcomed death as a release from something worse than death. When Marfa Sobakina was selected as Ivan's third wife in 1571, she was immediately subjected to what court documents call preparation for the sacred duties of marriage. This preparation was distinct from the evaluation process that had already consumed months of her life. It was designed not to assess her, but to transform her. The preparation took place in a section of the Kremlin specially designated for incoming Tsarinas. Marfa was moved there immediately after the selection was announced, separated from her family, surrounded by attendants who answered to Ivan rather than to her. She would not see her parents again until the wedding, and after the wedding she would see them only under supervised conditions that made genuine communication impossible. The first stage of preparation was physical. Marfa was bathed extensively, not once, but repeatedly over several days, using waters infused with herbs that court physicians claimed would purify her body and enhance her fertility. The bathing was conducted by female attendants who examined her closely during the process, documenting every detail of her physical form for records that would be kept in the royal archives. Her hair was treated with oils and unguents that would make it shine during the wedding ceremony. Her skin was treated with preparations that would give it the appropriate glow. Her teeth were cleaned with abrasive mixtures that court dentists applied directly. Her nails were shaped and polished. Every visible aspect of her appearance was refined according to specifications that someone, presumably Ivan himself, had determined. But the physical preparation extended beyond cosmetics. Marfa was also subjected to what the documents call medical examination to ensure readiness for marital duties. The details of these examinations are not explicitly described, but their nature can be inferred from the personnel-involved physicians who specialized in women's health, midwives who would later attend her during pregnancy, attendants whose reports focused specifically on her capacity for bearing. Modern historians who have analyzed these records recognize them as documenting procedures that were invasive, degrading, and designed primarily to establish dominance rather than to gather necessary medical information. The preparation was training teaching Marfa that her body no longer belonged to her, that it was state property to be inspected and modified at will. The second stage of preparation was psychological. Marfa was instructed in her duties as Tsarina, not the ceremonial duties that she might have expected, but the personal duties that she would owe to Ivan specifically. These instructions were delivered by female relatives of previous Tsarinas, women who had witnessed what happened to their sisters and daughters, and who understood exactly what Marfa was being prepared for. The instructions covered behavior in public and in private, how to walk in Ivan's presence 3 steps behind, eyes lowered unless addressed directly, how to speak briefly, softly, never contradicting, never questioning, never expressing independent opinion, how to respond to his moods, recognizing the signs of approaching rage, knowing when to withdraw and when to submit, understanding that her survival depended on reading his emotional state correctly. The instructions also covered what the documents call the private duties of the marriage bed. The details of these instructions were not recorded in official documents, but fragments survive in letters written by women who underwent similar preparation for marriages to other Russian nobles. What these fragments describe is essentially training in submission-detailed instruction in how to accept whatever a husband might demand, while maintaining the appearance of willing participation. One fragment, written by a noblewoman who underwent preparation in 1543 for marriage to a boyar, describes the instruction in terms that modern psychologists immediately recognize. They told us that our desires did not matter. They told us that our feelings were irrelevant. They told us that whatever our husbands wished to do, we must accept with gratitude. They told us that resistance was sin not merely against our husbands, but against God, who had created women to serve men. By the end of the instruction, I no longer believed I had the right to refuse anything. I had been taught that my own soul was worthless compared to my husband's pleasure. Marfa underwent 2 weeks of this instruction. By the time she emerged for the wedding ceremony, witnesses described her as transformed, not radiant with bridal joy, but subdued, careful, watchful in ways that suggested she had learned exactly what was expected of her and understood exactly what would happen if she failed to deliver. The wedding took place on October 28, 1571. It was the most elaborate ceremony Moscow had ever seen. 3 days of festivities, thousands of guests, treasures displayed that had been accumulated over centuries of Russian expansion. Foreign ambassadors reported that the cost exceeded the annual revenue of several minor kingdoms. Marfa performed her role flawlessly. She spoke the required words, made the required gestures, demonstrated the required submission. When Ivan led her to the bridal chamber, she went without hesitation. What happened in that chamber is not recorded directly. What is recorded is that within days of the wedding, Marfa began showing symptoms of illness that the royal physicians could not explain. Ivan's marriages followed a pattern that historians have documented through careful analysis of court records, diplomatic correspondence, and the fragmentary accounts that survive from within the Kremlin itself. After the wedding came the testing period, a time during which the new Tsarina was subjected to escalating demands designed to measure the completeness of her submission. The testing began immediately and intensified over the first weeks of marriage. For Marfa Sobakina, the testing began on the wedding night. The accounts that survive are fragmentary, filtered through servants who witnessed only portions of what happened, and who were themselves terrified to report accurately. But the pattern they describe is consistent with what is documented for Ivan's other marriages. Ivan demanded not merely submission, but enthusiasm, visible, audible evidence that his new wife welcomed whatever he chose to do. Mere compliance was not sufficient. The Tsarina had to perform satisfaction, had to demonstrate pleasure in her service, had to convince Ivan that she genuinely desired to be used as he wished. This requirement created an impossible bind. A woman who genuinely felt pleasure might be suspected of being unchaste, of having learned responses that should only come from experience. A woman who clearly felt no pleasure might be accused of coldness, of failing to appreciate the honor of serving the Tsar. The only safe path was convincing performance, and Ivan was skilled at detecting performance, at identifying the tells that revealed pretense rather than sincerity. Marfa apparently failed one of these tests within the first week of marriage. The evidence is indirect but consistent. Court records show that Ivan ordered an investigation into Marfa's background within days of the wedding, an investigation that re-examined every aspect of her life before coming to Moscow, every person she had known, every place she had been. The investigation was looking for evidence of prior experience that might explain responses Ivan had observed. Simultaneously, Marfa began receiving the poison that would kill her. Modern forensic analysis of her remains, conducted by Russian scientists in the 21st century, identified elevated levels of arsenic and mercury in her bones and hair. The concentrations were consistent with repeated low-dose poisoning over approximately 2 weeks. The symptoms this poisoning would cause match the symptoms documented in court medical records: weakness, nausea, trembling, confusion, and eventually organ failure. Ivan was poisoning his new wife while simultaneously investigating whether she had deceived him about her past. The two activities were connected. If the investigation found evidence of unchastity, the poisoning could be accelerated to death, and the death could be attributed to divine judgment. If the investigation found nothing, the poisoning could be reduced to levels that would keep her sick and dependent without actually killing her. Marfa died on November 13th, 1571, 15 days after her wedding, 12 days after the poisoning apparently began. Ivan's response to her death revealed more than perhaps he intended. He did not mourn as he had mourned his first wife, Anastasia. He did not rage as he might have if he believed his bride had been murdered by enemies. Instead, he immediately launched investigations into witchcraft against the Sobakina family investigations that resulted in executions, confiscations, and the destruction of an entire clan. The pattern was clear to foreign observers even at the time. A Venetian diplomat wrote to his superiors, "The Tsar has found a new method for dealing with families who gain too much influence through marriage to the throne. He marries their daughter, destroys her within weeks, and then uses her death as justification for destroying the family. The marriage itself was the trap. The girl was dead the moment she was selected. Not every wife was killed. Some were disposed of through methods that the church and state considered more acceptable methods that ended the marriage without ending the woman's life, at least in the physical sense. Anna Koltovskaya was 20 years old when she married Ivan in 1572, just months after Marfa's death. She was the fourth wife, selected through a bride show that was notably smaller and less elaborate than previous ones. By this point, noble families understood what marriage to Ivan meant, and fewer were willing to offer their daughters. Anna lasted approximately 1 year. During that year, according to servant accounts, she learned to survive through absolute self-effacement. She never spoke unless addressed. She never expressed preferences or desires. She never gave Ivan any grounds for suspicion or complaint. She was, by all accounts, the perfect example of the prepared wife, completely broken, completely compliant, completely empty. This was not enough. Ivan announced in 1573 that Anna was being sent to a convent for the good of her soul. The official explanation was that she had failed to bear children and that her continued presence in the Kremlin was therefore unnecessary. The unofficial explanation whispered in court corridors was that Ivan had grown bored with her absolute compliance. A wife who never resisted provided no satisfaction to a man who found pleasure in breaking resistance. Anna was transported to a convent outside Moscow and confined to a cell that measured approximately 8 feet by 8 feet. She was given the religious name Daria and forbidden to use her birth name or any title she had held as Tsarina. She was forbidden to communicate with anyone outside the convent, except through supervised letters that were read by church officials before delivery. She was forbidden to leave her cell, except for required religious services. She remained in that cell for the next 42 years. Anna Koltovskaya died in 1626, aged approximately 67. She had spent 42 years in a space the size of a modern prison cell, forbidden to speak of her past, forbidden to contact her family, forbidden to exist as the person she had been. The convent records describe her final years in terms that suggest she had long since lost the capacity for normal human interaction. Sister Daria no longer speaks except in prayers. She no longer recognizes visitors. She sits in her cell and rocks, and sometimes she makes sounds that might be weeping or might be something else. The physicians say her mind has gone. We believe she went to a place inside herself many years ago and simply never returned. This was the alternative to death. This was what Ivan considered mercy. Let me tell you now about Maria Dolgorukaya, whose story is the most horrific in the catalogue of Ivan's crimes against women, and whose fate demonstrates the absolute power that the Tsar wielded over the bodies of women in his realm. Maria was selected as Ivan's 5th wife in 1573, shortly after Anna Koltovskaya was sent to her convent. She was 19 years old, from a noble family with strong connections to the old Muscovite aristocracy. Her selection was controversial. The Dolgorukayas had opposed some of Ivan's policies, and choosing their daughter seemed like either a gesture of reconciliation or a trap. It was a trap. The wedding took place with full ceremony. The festivities lasted 3 days. Foreign ambassadors attended and reported that the bride was beautiful. The Tsar appeared satisfied, and the marriage seemed as auspicious as any of Ivan's previous unions. On the morning after the wedding night, Ivan ordered Maria drowned in the Moscow River. The execution was public. Maria was dragged from the Kremlin to the river by Oprichnina, who made no attempt to hide what they were doing. She was bound, weighted with stones, and thrown into the water while crowds watched. The entire process, from her emergence from the bridal chamber to her death, took approximately 2 hours. The official explanation was that Ivan had discovered Maria was not a virgin, that she had deceived him, and the bride show commissioners that she had concealed prior experience that should have disqualified her from consideration. The punishment for this deception was death. But the pattern suggests something else. Foreign observers who were present during the bride show reported that Maria had been examined extensively, more extensively than previous candidates, with multiple physicians confirming her status. If she had not been a virgin, the examination would have detected it. Either the examination was incompetent, or Ivan's accusation was false. Modern historians believe the accusation was false, that Ivan had decided to destroy Maria and the Dolgorukaya family before the wedding even took place, and that the accusation of unchastity was simply the justification he chose to use. The evidence supports this interpretation. Within days of Maria's death, Ivan launched investigations into the Dolgorukaya family that resulted in mass arrests, confiscations, and executions. The family was effectively destroyed, their lands seized, their titles revoked, their members scattered into exile, prison, or death. Maria's execution was the trigger for this destruction. Whether she was actually unchaste was irrelevant. What mattered was that Ivan had found a justification, that the church and state would accept a justification that made her death legal and proper, that made her family's destruction appear to be justice rather than tyranny. The message to other noble families was clear. Any daughter offered to the Tsar was a hostage. Her survival depended entirely on Ivan's whim, and Ivan's whim was murderously unpredictable. By the mid-1570s, Ivan's treatment of women had evolved from individual brutality into something more organized, a system that extended far beyond his personal wives to encompass the wives and daughters of any noble who attracted his attention. The Oprichnina provided the mechanism for this system. Ivan's black-robed enforcers operated outside normal legal restraints. They could arrest anyone, confiscate anything, execute anyone, all in the Tsar's name, all without accountability. And among their targets, women were particularly vulnerable. When an Oprichnik visited a noble household to investigate suspected disloyalty, the investigation typically followed a specific pattern. The male head of household would be arrested and taken to the Alexandrov Kremlin for interrogation. His wife and daughters would remain in the household, but they would remain as hostages, their treatment entirely dependent on what their husband or father revealed under questioning. The treatment of these women was documented in records that survived because the Oprichniki kept meticulous files on everyone they investigated. These files, preserved in Russian archives and only partially published, describe what happened to women whose male relatives were suspected of opposing Ivan. The first stage was isolation. The women were confined to their homes, forbidden to leave, forbidden to communicate with anyone outside the household. Servants were replaced with Oprichniki agents who reported every word, every action, every sign of potential disloyalty. The second stage was interrogation. The women were questioned about their husbands' or fathers' activities, associations, opinions. The interrogators were not gentle. The records describe methods that modern readers recognize as torture, sleep deprivation, stress positions, threats against children, and methods euphemistically described as physical persuasion. The third stage was what the records call utilization. If the male relative confessed, the women were typically disposed of, killed, confined to convents, or distributed to Oprichniki as rewards for loyal service. If the male relative refused to confess, the women were used as leverage, their suffering described to the prisoner in detail, their cries made audible through cell walls, their bodies made available for whatever might break the prisoner's resistance. One record describes the process with chilling administrative precision. Suspect Mikhail Vorotinsky refuses to confess despite 3 days of standard questioning. His wife Irina and daughter Sophia are currently in custody at the secondary facility. Recommend implementing family pressure protocols. Detailed description of current treatment to suspect, followed by audio exposure, followed by visual evidence. If standard family pressure fails to produce confession, recommend proceeding to enhanced family pressure with appropriate documentation. The document does not specify what enhanced family pressure involved. The absence of specification is itself significant. It suggests practices too extreme to record even in classified files, practices that everyone involved understood without needing explicit description. The Novgorod massacre of 1570 provides the most comprehensive evidence of what Ivan's system did to women on a mass scale. In January 1570, Ivan became convinced that the city of Novgorod, one of the oldest and wealthiest cities in Russia, was plotting to defect to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The evidence for this plot was, at best, questionable. But Ivan did not require proof. He required only suspicion. The Oprichnina descended on Novgorod with approximately 1,500 men, Over the following 5 weeks, they systematically destroyed the city and its population. The death toll estimates range from 20,000 to 60,000, a significant portion of Novgorod's entire population. What happened to the women of Novgorod was documented by survivors and foreign observers in terms that historians have largely chosen not to translate or publish in full. The pattern was consistent. Oprichnina would enter a household, arrest the men, and gather the women and children for processing. Processing meant different things depending on the circumstances, the wealth of the household, the perceived guilt of the men, the mood of the Oprichnina conducting the operation. Some women were killed immediately, typically by drowning in the Volkhov River. The river was frozen in January, so the Oprichnina cut holes in the ice and pushed women and children through them. Witnesses described lines of people waiting on the ice, watching as those ahead of them disappeared into the black water, knowing they would follow within minutes. Some women were kept alive for what the records call entertainment. The details of this entertainment are not explicitly recorded, but the fragments that survive make the nature of the activities clear. One German merchant who escaped the massacre described what he witnessed in a letter that was preserved in Lübeck archives. The soldiers in black took women into the houses and did not emerge for many hours. The sounds that came from those houses I cannot describe. When they emerged, the women did not emerge with them. I believe no women from those houses ever emerged. Some women were kept as prizes distributed among the Oprichnina as rewards for their service. These women were transported back to Oprichnina estates, where they served as what contemporary documents call household captives. Their legal status was unclear. They were not quite slaves, not quite wives, not quite servants. They existed in a category created specifically for women seized during Oprichnina operations, with no rights and no recourse. The Novgorod massacre lasted 5 weeks. By the time Ivan was satisfied, the city had been reduced from one of Russia's greatest centers of commerce and culture to a depopulated ruin that would take decades to recover. And among the dead and disappeared, women and children outnumbered men by a significant margin. They were easier to catch, easier to kill, easier to use for whatever purposes the Oprichnina devised. Let me tell you now about 4 other women whose fates demonstrate the range of what Ivan's system could do. Anna Vasilchikova was approximately 23 years old when she became Ivan's 6th wife in 1575. She lasted less than 1 year. Unlike Maria Dolgorukaya, she was not killed. Unlike Anna Koltovskaya, she was not simply set aside. She was subjected to what the records call correction, a process designed to break her completely before discarding her. The details of Anna's correction survive in fragments of letters she was somehow able to smuggle out of confinement. These letters were discovered in the 19th century in a family archive and have been partially published by Russian historians. They have put me in a room with no window. I do not know if it is day or night. They bring food at intervals that seem random sometimes. I am fed twice in what feels like hours, sometimes not at all for what feels like days. I cannot tell if I am going mad or if this is designed to make me mad. Perhaps both. A woman came today. She said she was a physician. She examined me in ways I cannot describe in writing. She said I was being prepared for my next role. I do not know what this means. I am afraid to know. I have not spoken to another human being in. I do not know how long. The servants who bring food do not respond when I speak. They look at me as if I am not there. I am beginning to wonder if I am there. Perhaps I have already died, and this is the punishment that follows death. Anna Vasilchikova was eventually sent to a convent, like Anna Koltovskaya. But by the time she arrived, according to the convent records, she was no longer capable of normal communication. She spent her remaining years in a state that the nuns described as living death, physically present but mentally absent, responding to nothing, showing no awareness of her surroundings or the passage of time. She died in 1577, aged approximately 25. The cause of death was recorded as failure to thrive, the medieval equivalent of saying that her body simply gave up. Vasilisa Melentieva was the woman Ivan chose after Anna Vasilchikova proved unsatisfying. Her selection was unusual. She was not chosen through a formal bride show, but spotted by Ivan during a court function and simply taken. She was the widow of a minor official, perhaps 25 years old, and she had caught the Tsar's eye. For approximately 2 years, Vasilisa survived. The records suggest she had learned from her predecessor's fates. She offered no resistance, expressed no opinions, made no demands. She existed in the Kremlin as a beautiful piece of furniture present when required, invisible when not, never giving Ivan any reason for displeasure. And then, in 1577, she made a mistake. The details vary depending on the source. Some accounts say she was caught in conversation with a young nobleman, and the conversation was interpreted as flirtation or worse. Some accounts say she was seen accepting a small gift, a handkerchief, perhaps, or a piece of fruit from a man other than Ivan. Some accounts say she simply looked at someone the wrong way at the wrong moment. Whatever the trigger, Ivan's response was extreme. Vasilisa and the young man whose name was Ivan Kolichev were both arrested and subjected to what the records call examination in the chambers beneath the Alexandrov Kremlin. What happened during this examination can be inferred from the outcome. Both Vasilisa and Kolichev were executed, she by drowning, he by impalement. Before their executions, both confessed to an adulterous affair that had been ongoing for months. The confessions were almost certainly false, extracted through methods that the Oprichniki had perfected over years of practice. But false confessions served Ivan's purposes as well as true ones. He had grown tired of Vasilisa. He needed a justification for disposing of her that would make him appear as the wronged party, rather than the aggressor. An adultery accusation provided exactly that justification. Maria Nagaya was the last of Ivan's wives, the woman who was still married to him when he died in 1584. Her survival was not a sign of his mercy. It was a sign of his deterioration. By the early 1580s, Ivan was dying. Years of mercury treatments for various ailments had poisoned his system. Years of alcohol abuse had damaged his liver and brain. Years of violence had perhaps exhausted even his capacity for destruction. He was in his early 50s, but appeared decades older, according to foreign observers who saw him in his final years. Maria Nagaya was 20 years old when she married Ivan in 1580. She was his 7th or 8th wife. Historians disagree on whether one of his earlier relationships constituted a legal marriage. She bore him one son, Dmitri, and she spent the 4 years of their marriage in constant terror. The terror was justified. Ivan continued his patterns of abuse even as his body failed. He continued the interrogations, the accusations, the threats. He simply lacked the energy to follow through as completely as he once had. One account, preserved in the memoirs of a foreign physician who attended Ivan in his final years, describes the dynamic. The Tsar still rages at his wife, still accuses her of conspiracies that exist only in his diseased mind. But the rage exhausts him now. He begins to denounce her and falls asleep mid-sentence. He orders her punished and forgets the order before it can be executed. The Tsarina has learned to wait out his episodes, knowing that his attention will fade before he can fully act on his impulses. She survives by outlasting his capacity for sustained malice. Maria outlasted him. Ivan died in March 1584. Apparently of natural causes, though rumors of poison persisted for years. Maria survived to raise their son Dmitri, who would eventually become the center of the succession crisis that led to Russia's time of troubles. But her survival was not safety. After Ivan's death, Maria was sent to Uglich, a minor city far from Moscow, where she was kept in effective exile. She was blamed for the death of the young Dmitri in 1591, blamed by enemies who found it convenient to accuse a woman who had been Ivan's wife. She was forced to become a nun, confined to a convent, and disappeared from history. Her fate, after taking the veil, is uncertain. Some accounts say she died in obscurity. Some accounts say she was secretly killed. Some accounts say she lived into the 17th century, an old woman whose identity had been erased so completely that no one remembered she had once been Tsarina. Modern forensic analysis has provided physical evidence for what historical sources long suspected. In 1963, Soviet scientists exhumed the remains of Ivan the Terrible and several of his family members from the Archangel Cathedral in the Moscow Kremlin. The examination used techniques available at the time, primarily visual examination and basic chemical analysis, and found evidence of mercury poisoning in Ivan's remains. More significant were the examinations of his wives' remains. Anastasia Romanovna, Ivan's first wife, the one he genuinely seemed to love, showed evidence of arsenic poisoning. Her hair contained arsenic at levels far above normal, consistent with repeated poisoning over an extended period. This finding, published in 2004 after re-examination with modern equipment, suggested that even Ivan's beloved first wife may have been poisoned, possibly by enemies, possibly by Ivan himself, in one of his paranoid episodes. Marfa Sobakina's remains showed similar evidence of arsenic and mercury poisoning. The levels were higher than Anastasia's, consistent with more aggressive poisoning over a shorter period. This matched the historical accounts of her rapid decline and death within 15 days of her wedding. Maria Temryakovna's remains were too degraded for definitive analysis, but what could be examined showed patterns consistent with chronic poisoning. The findings suggested that her 8 years of decline were not simply psychological, but were accompanied by physical poisoning that contributed to her deterioration and death. These forensic findings have transformed historical understanding of Ivan's treatment of his wives. What might have been dismissed as paranoid illness or psychological breakdown can now be identified as deliberate poisoning, a pattern of premeditated murder, disguised as natural illness or divine judgment. The Tsar was killing his wives. He was doing so deliberately, systematically, and over extended periods that maximized their suffering while minimizing the evidence of his involvement. The forensic evidence confirms what the behavioral evidence long suggested. Ivan's treatment of women was not madness, but method. Let me tell you now what modern psychologists have learned about the patterns in Ivan's behavior and about the techniques he used to break the women in his life. The pattern that emerges from analysis of Ivan's relationships with women matches what contemporary psychologists call systematic intimate partner abuse with institutional support. The elements are consistent across every documented case. First, the selection of vulnerable targets. The bride shows specifically identified women who would be isolated from their support networks, whose families were too weak to resist, whose personalities suggested pliability rather than resistance. The selection process was designed to find victims who could be broken efficiently. Second, the establishment of absolute control. Every woman who entered Ivan's orbit was immediately separated from anyone who might support her. Her environment was controlled completely: what she ate, where she slept, who she saw, what she wore. This control established that her survival depended entirely on Ivan's approval. Third, the installation of fear through unpredictability. Ivan's alternation between kindness and cruelty, between affection and rage, kept his victims in constant anxiety. They could never relax, never feel safe, never establish psychological equilibrium. This chronic stress response made resistance progressively more difficult. Fourth, the destruction of identity. Through isolation, through humiliation, through the systematic denial of agency and autonomy, Ivan's victims were gradually stripped of their sense of self. By the time they were disposed of through death, through convents, through mere abandonment, many had lost the capacity to function as independent persons. Fifth, The use of witnesses. Ivan's abuse was never entirely private. Servants witnessed. Oprichnina participated. Other court members observed. This public aspect served multiple purposes. It implicated others in the abuse. It demonstrated the consequences of resistance. And it normalized the treatment so that victims questioned their own perceptions. Modern trauma specialists who have analyzed the available evidence recognize these patterns as maximally effective for breaking human beings while maintaining deniability. The techniques Ivan used, whether developed through deliberate study or through intuitive refinement, represent something like an optimal approach to psychological destruction. Approximately 90% of Ivan's wives and known intimate partners died prematurely, were confined to institutions, or disappeared under circumstances suggesting violence. This percentage is statistically impossible to attribute to coincidence or bad luck. It represents the outcome of a system designed to destroy women efficiently and with minimal accountability. The historical records contain one document that has never been fully published, a letter allegedly written by Ivan himself near the end of his life, discovered in a private archive in the 19th century and currently held in a Russian state collection. The letter's authenticity is disputed. Some historians believe it is genuine. Others believe it is a later fabrication designed to vilify Ivan. But the content, whether genuine or imagined by a later author, captures something essential about Ivan's attitude toward the women in his life. The letter appears to be addressed to no one in particular, perhaps intended as a private confession, perhaps as a justification for posterity. It reads in part, "They ask me why so many of my wives have died, as if I were responsible for the frailty of women and the judgments of God. I tell them, I chose each woman with care. I prepared each woman according to the requirements of her position. I tested each woman to confirm her suitability, and when a woman failed as so many failed, I disposed of her according to the requirements of the throne. A czar cannot be weak in any matter. He cannot be weak in war. He cannot be weak in statecraft, and he cannot be weak in his own household. A wife who does not submit perfectly is a threat to the entire realm. She must be corrected or removed. There is no third option. I take no pleasure in the correction or removal of wives. I take pleasure only in the order that correction and removal maintain. A realm requires order. A household requires order. A marriage requires order. And I have maintained order in all these things, whatever the cost. Those who judge me do not understand the weight of the crown. They do not understand that a czar must sometimes destroy what he loves for the sake of what he rules. They do not understand that a woman is only a woman, while a realm is eternal. Whether these words are genuinely Ivan's or not, they capture the ideology that made his treatment of women possible. Women were not persons to Ivan. They were instruments. Their suffering was not cruelty. It was administration. Their destruction was not murder. It was governance. This ideology, the reduction of women to objects, the equation of abuse with order, persisted in Russian autocracy for centuries after Ivan's death. It influenced how czars treated their wives and how nobles treated theirs. It created a template for institutional misogyny that survived until the 20th century and arguably persists in modified forms today. Let me tell you, finally, what happened to the women I have described and what happened to their memories. Maria Temryukovna died in 1569, aged approximately 26. She was buried in the Kremlin with honors appropriate to a czarina. Her grave was maintained for centuries, but no biography was ever written. No monument was ever raised. She became a footnote. Ivan's second wife died young, her 8 years of suffering compressed into a single line in genealogical records. Marfa died in 1571, aged approximately 19. She was czarina for 15 days. Her grave was marked with a simple stone that gave her name and dates, but said nothing about how she died. The forensic evidence of her poisoning was not discovered for over 400 years. Maria Dolgorukaya was drowned in 1573. She was approximately 19 years old. Her body was recovered from the river and buried, but the location of her grave was not recorded. Her family was destroyed in the weeks that followed, and no one remained who might have cared to remember where she lay. Anna Koltovskaya died in her convent cell in 1626, aged approximately 67. She had been confined for 42 years. Her grave is in the convent cemetery, marked with a stone that gives her religious name Sister Daria, and makes no mention of the 4 decades she spent in a cell the size of a closet. Anna Vasilchikova died in her convent in 1577, aged approximately 25. The nuns who attended her recorded that she died peacefully, having found the rest she sought. This was probably a kind lie. She had spent her final years in a state of complete psychological collapse, and rest was simply the cessation of suffering she no longer had the capacity to understand. Vasilisa Melentieva was drowned in 1577, aged approximately 27. Her body was displayed publicly for several days as a warning about the consequences of adultery. When the display ended, she was buried without ceremony in an unmarked location. Maria Nagaya disappeared into a convent after her son's death in 1591. She was approximately 30 years old. Her death date is not recorded. No grave has ever been identified as hers. For Maria Temryukovna, who was 18 years old when she was selected as Tsarina, who spent 8 years being slowly destroyed through isolation and poison and psychological torture, who died at 26 with the face of an old woman, broken in ways that the 16th century did not have words to describe. For Marfa Sobakina, who was 19 years old when she was selected as Tsarina, who spent 15 days married to a man who was already poisoning her, who died before she had any chance to understand what had happened, who became the justification for massacres she never knew about. For Maria Dolgorukaya, who was 19 years old when she was selected as Tsarina, who survived one night of marriage, who was drowned in a river while crowds watched, who was accused of crimes that even her accusers knew she did not commit. For Anna Koltovskaya, who was 20 years old when she was selected as Tsarina, who learned to survive through absolute self-erasure, who spent 42 years in a cell where she could not extend her arms, who died having forgotten there was ever anything else. For Anna Vasilchikova, who was 23 years old when she was selected as Tsarina, who was subjected to correction that destroyed her mind, who spent her final years in a state that the nuns called living death, who died at 25 of failure to thrive. For Vasilisa Melentieva, who was approximately 25 years old when she caught Ivan's eye, who survived 2 years through absolute submission, who died because she looked at someone the wrong way, whose body was displayed as a warning about the consequences of being noticed by the wrong man. For Maria Nagaya, who was 20 years old when she married Ivan, who survived by outlasting his capacity for sustained malice, who was exiled and confined and erased after his death, who disappeared into a convent and was never heard from again. For the women of Novgorod, the thousands who were drowned, the unknown number who were used as entertainment, the ones who were taken as prizes and whose names were never recorded, who died in the frozen river, or in the houses the Oprichniki entered, who suffered things that survivors could not bring themselves to describe in full. For the wives and daughters of nobles investigated by the Oprichniki, the women who were isolated and interrogated and subjected to family pressure protocols, who were used as leverage against men who loved them, who suffered to extract confessions that might have been true or might have been false, but whose suffering was real regardless. For the servants who witnessed and could not intervene, the women who attended the Tsarinas through their preparations and their tortures and their deaths, who carried what they saw in silence because speaking meant their own deaths, who survived by becoming invisible. For the nuns who received the discarded wives, the women who watched Anna Koltovskaya and Anna Vasilchikova and others deteriorate over years and decades, who documented the decline in records that were never meant to be read, who provided what comfort they could to women who had been broken beyond the possibility of repair. They were not statistics. They were not historical footnotes. They were not supporting characters in Ivan's biography. They were human beings, women with names and families and lives that were systematically destroyed by a man who held absolute power and a system that gave him absolute impunity. Their suffering was not madness. It was policy. Their destruction was not tragedy. It was governance. Their erasure from history was not accidental. It was intentional because power always hides what it does to women, because empires always erase the evidence of their crimes, because the powerful always write histories that make their victims invisible. Our remembering them is necessary because they were real, because the techniques used on them, the isolation, the surveillance, the unpredictability, the identity destruction, are still used on vulnerable people today. Because silence enables continuation. Because speaking the truth about historical atrocities is how we prevent modern ones. This is what Ivan the Terrible did to women. This is what Hollywood cannot show you, not because the story is too old or too foreign, but because the truth is too systematic, too complete, too much like things that still happen today. This is what happens when a man holds absolute power and chooses to use it for destruction. This is what empires do to women and then pretend never happened. When you hear the name Ivan the Terrible, remember this. Remember that his terror was not random. It was targeted. Remember that his victims were not just political enemies. They were women who had no politics except survival. Remember that his system was not chaos. It was method. Remember that his wives did not simply die. They were killed slowly, deliberately, with techniques designed to maximize suffering while maintaining deniability. Remember that the forgetting was intentional. Remember that the silence was enforced. Remember that the erasure was policy. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below, telling me where in the world you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they know about Ivan the Terrible, but has only heard about the politics and the conquests. The women were real. The suffering was real. The system was real. And they deserve to be remembered.